I used to think my life was predictable. Routine, maybe. Every morning the alarm rang at 6:30 a.m. I'd stretch, kiss Claire on the forehead, and head down to start the coffee. By the time she joined me at the table, I'd have already checked my emails and half skimmed the headlines of the day. Today should have been no different, except it was. This morning I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I dismissed it as pre-event nerves. Claire and I had been invited to a yacht party, something rare for us. We weren't exactly yacht party people. My small business barely kept us afloat most months, and Claire was a teacher, not exactly rolling in cash. The invitation had come through one of Claire's colleagues who somehow knew the host, James Harding, a billionaire with an empire in real estate. "Relax," Claire had said that morning, noticing the tension in my face. "We'll go, have a few drinks, and leave early if you don't feel comfortable." I had smiled, but her words didn't ease the discomfort knotting in my stomach. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something in her tone felt hollow, rehearsed. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was the looming feeling of being out of place among people who probably had more money in their ashtrays than I did in my entire savings. When we arrived at the marina, my stomach clenched. The yacht was enormous, gleaming under the afternoon sun. It was a far cry from the cozy suburban life we lived, where Friday nights were spent binge-watching old crime dramas, not hobnobbing with the ultra-wealthy. Claire seemed to light up the second we stepped aboard. She moved through the crowd with a confidence I hadn't seen before, easily slipping into conversations with strangers while I hung back, feeling more like an intruder than a guest. The first sign of trouble came when I noticed how her eyes darted around the deck, scanning the guests. It was subtle, but it was there, a restlessness I hadn't noticed before. And then I saw her eyes land on Harding. He was surrounded by a small group of admirers, people hanging on to his every word as he held court, flashing a charismatic smile. I watched as Claire's face changed. Her casual smile stiffened into something more intense. Admiration? Maybe. Fascination? Definitely. Throughout the night, that spark between them grew more palpable. Claire kept finding excuses to wander closer to Harding's group, always laughing a little too loudly at his jokes, brushing her hair from her face in that way she does when she wants attention. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. She was just being friendly, I reasoned. But then there was a moment, an unmistakable moment, where their eyes locked for a beat too long. My heart sank into my stomach. As the evening went on, I couldn't shake the feeling of growing unease. I stuck close to the bar, nursing a drink while I watched her. She floated from conversation to conversation, but her eyes always found their way back to him. It was like I wasn't even there. I tried to join her at one point to make conversation, but she brushed me off, her gaze darting over my shoulder before excusing herself to get more champagne. I wasn't stupid. I'd been around enough people to read the signals, to see the shift in her demeanor. She was distracted, distant, like her mind was somewhere else. Someone else. Later, I overheard a snippet of a conversation. Claire's voice, low and almost conspiratorial, followed by Harding's unmistakable laugh. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough to light a fire in my chest. My hands clenched around the glass. I stood frozen, trying to pretend I didn't hear, trying to keep my composure. A little after midnight, she finally came to find me. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes brighter than I'd ever seen them. "Hey, let's go." "I think it's time to call it a night," she said, her words casual, but her hand didn't touch mine. She didn't even wait for me to respond before turning toward the exit. I followed her, silently fuming. As we walked down the dock to the car, I could feel the tension radiating from her, the way she was deliberately avoiding my gaze. "You seem to enjoy yourself tonight," I said, keeping my voice even. She looked at me, her smile brittle. "Yeah, it was nice." She trailed off, distracted. I didn't push further. I wasn't ready for the answers I might get. The drive home was silent, the only sound the hum of the engine as we passed empty streets. Claire stared out the window, her reflection faintly illuminated by the streetlights, but her mind seemed miles away. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed the evening in my head. Every glance, every touch, every lingering smile between Claire and Harding. My stomach twisted in knots, the growing suspicion gnawing at me like a parasite. Was I overreacting? Maybe, but maybe not. The next morning I woke early, my mind already racing. Claire was still asleep, her body curled up on her side of the bed, the sheets tangled around her legs. She looked peaceful, innocent even, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. Something was wrong. I knew it deep down in my gut. I spent the day going through the motions, trying to ignore the weight pressing down on my chest. I busied myself with work, making calls, replying to emails, trying to drown out the thoughts clawing at my brain. But nothing helped. I couldn't stop thinking about last night. About the way Claire had looked at Harding, the way she'd practically glowed in his presence. By the time evening rolled around, I had convinced myself that I was overreacting. Claire and I had been through rough patches before. This was just another bump in the road, I told myself. Nothing more. But then, as I passed by her phone charging on the kitchen counter, I saw the screen light up. A message. The name at the top made my blood run cold. James Harding. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest, my palms suddenly clammy. I didn't touch the phone, but the message was right there, glaring at me. Let's meet tomorrow. Same place as last time? The room seemed to spin. Same place as last time? My mind scrambled for answers, but the truth was staring me right in the face. This wasn't just flirtation. This wasn't just paranoia. This was real. Claire was meeting him, had already met him. I stood there, frozen, the weight of the message crushing down on me. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand answers. But another part of me, a darker, colder part, knew that this was just the beginning. I wasn't going to fly off the handle. No, I needed to think, to plan. Whatever was happening between them, I would uncover it, piece by piece. As I sat down at the kitchen table, my mind racing, one thing became clear. I wasn't going to let this slide. Claire had made her choice, but she had no idea what was coming next. The morning after reading the message from Harding, I couldn't focus on anything. Claire acted normal, if a little distant, as she sipped her coffee across the kitchen table from me. She didn't know I had seen the text, not yet, but the thought of her secret meetings with him gnawed at my insides like a parasite. I felt like I was trapped in a phone, the image of her with him playing over and over in my mind. I'll be home late tonight, she said casually, not even looking up from her phone. Work thing. My fingers tightened around my coffee mug. Another one? She gave a half shrug. It's been busy. Busy. Right. Busy meeting him. I forced myself to nod, swallowing the rising anger that threatened to choke me. Confronting her now would be a mistake. I needed to be smart about this. If I flew off the handle without proof, she would twist it, make me the crazy paranoid husband. No, I had to play this carefully. Sure, I said, keeping my voice steady. No problem. Claire barely acknowledged my response before gathering her things and heading out the door. As soon as I heard her car pull away, I grabbed my phone and called in sick to work. I wasn't going to sit around and do nothing while my marriage crumbled under the weight of her lies. I spent the next hour pacing the living room, my mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios. What was I supposed to do? Hire a private investigator? Follow her myself? Both ideas felt extreme, but I knew I needed to do something. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. This was real. I glanced at her phone still sitting on the counter. I hadn't touched it the night before, not wanting to leave any trace. Now I couldn't resist. I unlocked it easily, scrolling through her recent messages. The conversation with Harding was short, but enough to confirm everything. Tomorrow at 7, don't be late, he had written. She had responded with a heart emoji. My stomach churned with a sickening mix of rage and betrayal. The image of them together, laughing at some fancy restaurant or slipping into a hotel room, flashed through my mind. I wanted to smash the phone against the wall, but I couldn't let emotion get the best of me. Instead, I set it back down exactly where I found it and sat at the table trying to think clearly. I spent the rest of the morning planning. Every possibility, every angle. If Claire thought she could keep lying to my face, I would show her just how wrong she was. I'd been naive, but no longer. She had already made her move. Now it was my turn. That night, Claire came home late, as expected. She barely said a word to me as she walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I was on the couch pretending to watch TV, but my mind was elsewhere. I waited until she disappeared into the bedroom before slipping into her purse and finding the receipt. A fancy restaurant, just as I thought. I pocketed it, then went back to the living room, waiting. In the days that followed, I started noticing more discrepancies. Claire's work obligations increased, and her phone was never out of her sight. It was subtle at first. Late-night texts she claimed were from colleagues. Unexplained absences she waved off with vague excuses. But I knew the truth now, and with every new inconsistency, the distance between us grew. Our conversations became clipped, almost mechanical. I tried bringing up plans for the weekend or asking about her day, but her responses were short, disinterested. Every time I tried to reach for her, she slipped further away, and every time she pulled back, my suspicions deepened. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. One evening, after another work dinner, she came home with that same detached expression on her face. I asked her how it went. She shrugged, her answer evasive. I watched her as she moved around the kitchen, but her body language was telling. She was distracted, lost in thought, probably thinking about him. I waited until she went to bed before opening her laptop, hoping to find something, anything that would give me concrete evidence. She had logged out of her email this time, but she wasn't as careful as she thought. I managed to guess her password after a few tries. There it was, confirmation. Emails back and forth, planning dates, weekend getaways. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening as the betrayal became undeniable. There were pictures too, smiling together, him holding her close. They looked like a couple, not like a fling. My stomach lurched. The messages told me everything I needed to know. Their affair hadn't started recently. It had been going on for months. The Hawaii trip they were planning, just the two of them, was still weeks away. But the way they spoke to each other, the ease in their conversation, felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I stood there in the dark kitchen, the glow of the laptop screen casting eerie shadows on the walls. My hands shook with the weight of it all. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a full-blown second life she had been building with him behind my back. I closed the laptop, trying to steady my breathing. The anger inside me was like a furnace, burning hotter with each passing second. But I couldn't blow up now. That's what she expected me to do, to confront her, to lose control, but I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. The next few days were hell. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Claire carried on like nothing had changed, blissfully unaware that I knew her secret. I played along, pretending everything was fine, smiling when she smiled, nodding when she spoke, all the while seething beneath the surface. I felt like a ticking time bomb, just waiting for the right moment to explode. But something strange happened during that time. As much as the anger simmered inside me, I started to feel a cold, calculated clarity. The fog of confusion lifted, replaced by a sharp focus. I didn't just want to confront her anymore. I wanted her to pay for what she'd done, for how easily she had thrown away everything we had built together. And not just her, Harding too, the billionaire who thought he could take what was mine. He had no idea who he was dealing with. One night after Claire had fallen asleep, I sat in the living room staring at the ceiling, my mind working through every possibility. How could I make them both suffer? How could I hit them where it hurt the most? The ideas came slowly at first, but the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I couldn't just expose the affair. That would be too easy, too simple. No, I needed to dismantle everything, his life, his empire, and hers too. They had both made choices, and now they would pay for them. The next morning, Claire left for work as usual, oblivious to the fact that I was one step ahead of her. I had started digging into Harding's background, his business dealings, his assets. It wasn't difficult. For someone as wealthy and influential as he was, the man was surprisingly careless. Public records, financial filings, old news articles. All it took was a few hours of research to find the cracks in his seemingly perfect life. That evening, while Claire was out at yet another work meeting, I set my plan into motion. I didn't know how long it would take, but I was prepared to be patient. After all, the best revenge is served cold. I watched her closely over the next week, noting every detail, every lie she told with that smile on her face. She had no idea the trap I was laying for her, or the man she thought was her ticket to a better life. Soon enough, they would both know what it felt like to have everything crumble beneath their feet. The moment I had been waiting for came sooner than I expected. One night, as Claire was getting ready for another one of her secret meetings, I casually mentioned that I had plans of my own. Meeting a client, I lied, watching her reaction closely. She barely blinked, already too distracted by her own lies to notice mine. She left the house without a second thought, and I knew it was time. I followed her, staying just far enough behind to avoid detection. She drove to a restaurant on the edge of town, the same place where their affair had blossomed. I watched as she slipped into the booth across from Harding, their faces lit by the warm glow of the candlelight. I stayed outside, my heart pounding, my mind racing. This wasn't the endgame, but it was the beginning. I had what I needed. Now the real plan would begin. When I returned home that night, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Claire would never see it coming, neither would Harding. The pieces were falling into place, and soon enough they would both learn the price of betrayal. The plan formed slowly, like a dark fog creeping into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts and pulling them into a sharp focus. I had spent too many sleepless nights reeling from Claire's betrayal. The shock had given way to cold, calculated anger. This wasn't going to be about rage or impulsive actions. No, if I was going to make her and Harding suffer, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to be patient. I spent hours poring over every scrap of information I could find about Harding. His life was a public spectacle. His success splashed across every financial magazine and social media feed. The perfect billionaire, they called him, built from the ground up with nothing but grit and vision. But every empire, no matter how grand, had cracks. All I had to do was find them. The more I read, the more I saw how everything revolved around his image. He was a brand, an empire built on perception as much as on bricks and mortar. He cultivated his public persona like a master gardener, trimming away anything unsightly, ensuring everything bloomed in just the right way. But the truth was always uglier underneath the surface. I started tracking his movements. Discreetly, of course. It wasn't hard. Harding was the type of man who lived out loud, his every achievement documented, every deal broadcast to the world. He traveled between his offices, his lavish estates, his yacht, the same one where Claire had met him. And then there were the places that didn't make the headlines. Private rendezvous in hidden restaurants, weekend escapes with Claire to secluded resorts. I learned where they went, how often they met, and how careful they thought they were being. They weren't careful enough. It was during one of my late-night research sessions that I found it. A small article buried deep in a local paper, one no one with Harding's kind of wealth and influence would care about. A legal complaint, dismissed quietly, involving one of Harding's properties. The details were minor, a zoning issue, something that had been smoothed over with a few well-placed donations. But there was a name that jumped out, the company Harding had used to funnel the money through. It was a shell, of course, one of many. But it had been involved in a series of questionable transactions across several states, none of which had seen the light of day. It was like I had found the first loose thread in a very expensive suit, and I knew if I pulled on it hard enough, the whole thing would unravel. I couldn't help but smile at the thought. Harding had built his empire on charm and ruthless business tactics, but he wasn't invincible. He had vulnerabilities, hidden away behind layers of legal protection and financial obfuscation. But no one, not even billionaires, was completely untouchable. The first step was simple. I needed leverage, something concrete that I could use to start pulling those threads apart. That meant getting inside his circle. I knew Claire wouldn't be careful forever. She was too comfortable. too confident in her deceit. All I had to do was wait for her to slip, to let something useful fall into my hands. A week later, she gave me exactly what I needed. I watched from the shadows of the bedroom as she gathered her things for another business trip. She had become sloppy, distracted by the thrill of her double life with Harding. When she wasn't home, I searched her bags, her phone, and her computer. And there it was, a key card to one of Harding's private offices. Not his main headquarters. No, this was somewhere more intimate, a private space for his personal affairs, hidden from the public eye. She must have thought I wouldn't notice, but I did. The office was in a nondescript building, nothing that would attract attention. It took me a few days to figure out its location, to track down which of Harding's countless enterprises owned it, but I found it. And one night, while Claire was out with him, I used the key card she had so carelessly left behind. My heart pounded in my chest as I slipped inside the darkened building. This was the closest I'd ever been to Harding's world, his real world, the one he didn't show the cameras. The air smelled like money and secrets, the kind of place where people like him conducted their most private business. I moved through the office quietly, methodically, searching for anything that could give me an advantage. It didn't take long before I found it. A locked drawer in his desk, too obvious to be overlooked. It was too easy. I had prepared for this, knowing that a man like Harding wouldn't rely on a simple lock to protect his secrets. But the biometric fingerprint scanner on his desk, that was harder to fool. Harder, but not impossible. I'd already swiped Claire's laptop and phone fingerprints from items she'd left behind. After some research, I discovered a way to replicate prints using a simple mixture of adhesive and silicone. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The drawer opened with a soft click, and inside was a treasure trove. Documents, files, contracts, years of shady dealings and backroom deals. The deeper I dug, the more I realized just how much power Harding had amassed through these under-the-table transactions. But it was the offshore accounts that interested me the most. Accounts tied to bribes, to hidden funds that could ruin him if they ever saw the light of day. I copied everything I found, scanning the documents and sending them to a secure drive I had set up. Every page was a step closer to his downfall. I left the office that night knowing that I held the keys to Harding's destruction, but I wasn't done yet, not even close. When I returned home, I sat in the darkened living room, the weight of what I'd found sinking in. The power I now had, but it wasn't enough to just ruin Harding. Claire needed to suffer too. She had chosen him, craved his luxury, his wealth. She thought she could walk away from me, leave me behind like some discarded part of her past. But I wasn't just going to expose the affair. I wasn't just going to reveal her lies. No, I was going to make sure she felt the full weight of her choices. I waited for the right moment. Days passed as I carefully watched Claire's movements, her increasingly elaborate excuses to be away from the house, her glowing phone screen filled with messages she thought I couldn't see. But I saw everything now. Every text, every whisper of promise she sent to Harding. She was falling deeper into the web, and she didn't even know it. Then came the complication, and one I hadn't anticipated. One night, as Claire was preparing for yet another night out with him, she stopped suddenly, hesitating at the door. Her expression was strange, conflicted. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to be engrossed in the news. "Eric," she said, her voice softer than usual. I looked up, masking my surprise. "What is it?" For a brief moment, I thought maybe she was going to confess, that maybe some small part of her conscience had clawed its way to the surface. But instead, she said, "Do you think we could talk? Maybe when I get back?" My pulse quickened. This wasn't part of the plan. She hadn't shown an ounce of remorse in weeks. And now this? What was she playing at? "Sure," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "We can talk when you get back." She gave me a weak smile, one that didn't reach her eyes, before leaving the house. The door clicked shut, and I sat there in the silence trying to make sense of what had just happened. What did she want to talk about? Was she starting to have second thoughts? Was there something going on between her and Harding that I didn't know about? I couldn't let it shake me. Not now. The plan was too far along. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease that settled over me as I thought about her request. If Claire was reconsidering her choices, it could complicate things. I didn't need her trying to fix things between us. Not now that I was so close to pulling the trigger. As the night wore on, I realized I needed to adjust. I couldn't wait for her to make the first move. Whatever she had in mind when she said we should talk, I needed to stay ahead. This wasn't going to derail the plan. It was just another obstacle to overcome. The next day, I decided it was time to put the final pieces in place. Claire and Harding both thought they had everything under control, but soon they would see how wrong they were. I wasn't just going to expose their affair, I was going to dismantle their lives, piece by piece. That evening, I sent Harding a message. Posing as Claire, of course. It was easy enough to do. I knew how she wrote, the tone she used with him. All I needed to do was set the bait and wait for him to bite. He responded within minutes. They had no idea what was coming next. The next morning, I knew it was time to set my plan into motion. The calm before the storm had passed, and now every move had to be deliberate, precise. This wasn't just about Claire anymore. It was about dismantling everything Harding had built piece by piece. But I had to do it smartly, methodically. And I had the perfect leverage. I began by releasing the first set of information, just enough to make a dent, not to destroy him outright. I sent an anonymous tip to a reporter known for exposing corporate scandals. It was a simple email with some of the documents I'd retrieved from Harding's private office, highlighting one of his illegal transactions. It was enough to start the ball rolling, but not so much that it could be traced back to me. The beauty of it was that Harding wouldn't know who had targeted him or how much they had on him. He would be scrambling, paranoid, and defensive, while I stayed in the shadows pulling the strings. Within days, the news broke. A minor scandal at first, a whisper in the finance world, but it was enough to get his attention. I watched as Harding's publicists and legal teams scrambled to contain the fallout. His empire wasn't crumbling yet, but it had taken its first hit. The beauty of my plan was that I didn't need to bring him down all at once. The slow unraveling would do more damage than any single blow ever could. As I watched the headlines swirl, I couldn't help but feel the satisfaction building inside me. Harding had built his fortune on manipulation and deceit, and now he was going to taste it firsthand. But it wasn't enough, not yet. There was more to come. Claire continued her routine, oblivious to the chaos I was orchestrating behind the scenes. I kept up the facade of the attentive husband, playing my part perfectly. We even had the conversation she had suggested, her weak attempt at reconnecting, as if she was just now realizing the cracks she had caused in our marriage. She tried to act concerned, apologetic even, but I could see through it. The guilt was there, buried under layers of lies she had told herself to justify what she'd done. "I've been thinking about us," she said one night, her voice hesitant. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same place where so many of our now meaningless conversations had taken place. "Have you?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Inside, I was boiling, but I couldn't afford to let that slip. "Yeah, I just feel like things have been off between us," she said, her eyes searching mine for any sign of the old Eric, the one she thought she knew. "Off?" I repeated, my words slow, deliberate. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Maybe we've both just been busy, distracted," she said, wringing her hands. "But I want to try. I want to make things right." I studied her for a moment, wondering if she actually believed the garbage she was spewing. "Is that what you really want?" I asked, my voice just barely above a whisper. She nodded, and for a second, I almost laughed. She was still lying, still pretending. Even now, with everything she had done, she couldn't bring herself to admit the truth. But it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. "Okay," I said finally, forcing a smile. "Let's try." That was all she needed to hear. She smiled back, relieved, and for the rest of the evening, she acted as though things had returned to normal. But nothing was normal. I knew it, and soon enough she would too. While Claire believed I was softening, I continued my work. The next phase involved hitting Harding where it hurt the most, his business. I'd already exposed one of his smaller illegal deals, But now it was time to go after the heart of his empire. I needed something bigger, something that couldn't be brushed off by his PR team or smoothed over with a few bribes. That's where Claire came in, though she didn't even realize it. I kept monitoring her communications with Harding, looking for the right moment, and it didn't take long to find it. A text message popped up on her phone one evening while she was in the shower. "Meet me at the penthouse tomorrow night. We need to talk about the deal." It was perfect. I knew Harding had a series of offshore accounts linked to this deal. It was one of the bigger plays he'd been making for months, a real estate development that would make him millions. And Claire, in her naivete, was right in the middle of it, helping him coordinate the logistics. She had no idea that by participating, she was helping him hide illegal money transfers. I waited for her to leave the next day before heading back to the office building. The same key card she had so foolishly left in her purse before was still there, giving me access once again. This time I knew exactly what to look for. Records of the offshore accounts tied to the penthouse deal. As I sifted through the documents, it became clear that Harding was laundering money through this development, using shell companies to inflate the value of properties and funnel cash to his secret accounts. I made sure to download everything, but this time I was going to play it differently. Instead of sending the documents to the press, I sent them to a few key people in Harding's inner circle, trusted business partners, investors who had put millions into his projects. The fallout was immediate. Harding's empire began to tremble. His investors started to pull out, questioning his integrity, unsure whether they could trust him with their money. Rumors of fraud spread through his circle like wildfire. The penthouse deal began to fall apart, and Harding had no idea why. He was scrambling, trying to patch the holes, but they were too big to ignore now. I watched as the media picked up the pieces. More stories began to leak, anonymous tips about his shady deals, about the offshore accounts. I made sure to feed them just enough to keep the pressure building. It was working, but it wasn't enough to ruin Harding's career. I wanted to see his entire life fall apart. That meant dragging Claire into the mess she had helped create. One night, when she was out meeting Harding, I set the final part of my plan into motion. I sent Harding another message, posing as Claire again, saying she wanted to meet him at the penthouse to discuss the deal. Then I sent a second message, this time from a burner phone, to one of Harding's closest investors, telling him that he might want to check on his investment tonight. When Harding arrived at the penthouse, expecting to see Claire, he was greeted by the furious investor instead, along with a private investigator I'd hired to document everything. Harding's world was crumbling in real time, and I was the one holding the strings. Claire, of course, had no idea any of this was happening. When she returned home that night, she was quiet, her usual distant self, but I could tell something was wrong. Maybe she had started to feel the tension, the way Harding was slipping, or maybe she was just tired of pretending. The next morning, everything came to a head. Harding's name was splashed across every major news outlet, his company's stocks plummeting. He was accused of fraud, his business deals collapsing one by one. The media vultures were circling, and it was only a matter of time before the authorities started to investigate. Claire came home early that day, her face pale, her hands shaking. "Eric," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Something's happened." I looked up from the newspaper, pretending I didn't already know. "What is it?" "It's James. Something's wrong with his business. They're saying he did something illegal." I raised an eyebrow, feigning concern. "That's terrible." She sank into the chair across from me, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know what to do. I was involved in some of his deals. What if they think I had something to do with it?" I held back a smile. This was it, the moment she realized she wasn't just an innocent bystander. "Maybe you should talk to him," I suggested. "See what he says." She nodded, already reaching for her phone, but it was too late. Harding was finished, and Claire's perfect little world was about to collapse right along with him. I watched her panic unfold, every text she sent unanswered, every call to Harding going straight to voicemail. By the end of the day, she was pacing the living room, her nerves fraying with every passing minute, and that's when I made my move. I think you should tell me everything I said, my voice calm, steady. She froze, her eyes darting toward mine. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. What do you mean? I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. I know, Claire, about you and Harding. About everything. The blood drained from her face as the realization hit her. She had no idea that I had been the one pulling the strings all along, and now it was too late for her to escape. Everything was falling apart, and I was the one who had made it happen. I watched Claire as she processed the words. Her face had drained of color, her body rigid with the realization that her secret world had collapsed around her. The room felt suffocating with the weight of her silence, her eyes darting toward mine, desperate for some kind of denial, some salvation I wasn't going to give her. And you know? Her voice was a shaky whisper, barely audible over the tension crackling in the air. I leaned forward in my chair, slow, deliberate. I've known for a while, Claire. Everything. You and Harding, your little trips, the deals you were part of. I let the words hang, watching her unravel with each one. Her lips trembled, her hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles whitened. Eric, I didn't mean... Don't, I cut her off, my voice hard. Don't insult me by pretending there's anything left to say. I stood up, pushing the chair back with a loud scrape against the hardwood. The sharp sound broke the moment, a jagged edge cutting through her fragile defenses. She recoiled, sinking deeper into the chair as though shrinking from the confrontation. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but I felt nothing. Not pity, not sympathy. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I had spent weeks plotting, manipulating, and now it was time for her to understand the full extent of her betrayal. I thought you might have had a shred of decency left, I continued, pacing the room slowly. But then again, you sold that for Harding's money, didn't you? His yachts, his hotels. You were so willing to throw everything away for that life, for him. My words were sharp, biting, and I made no effort to soften the blows. Eric, please. Her voice broke, and for a moment it almost seemed genuine. Almost. I turned to face her fully, locking eyes with her. Don't beg, Claire. It's pathetic. The coldness in my tone was intentional, calculated. I wanted her to feel the sting, to realize there was no way out. She finally broke, the tears spilling over. I made a mistake, she cried. I got caught up in something I didn't understand. But I never meant to hurt you, Eric. I love you. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Love me? I repeated, incredulous. You love me while sneaking off with Harding, while helping him hide his dirty deals. Don't twist this, Claire. You love the life you thought you could have, the luxury he dangled in front of you. I was just the afterthought. The tears flowed freely now, and she buried her face in her hands. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I didn't know it would go this far. I made a mistake. I stared at her, unmoved by her display of regret. It was too late for apologies, too late for tears. This isn't about a mistake, Claire. This is about choices. You made yours. Her sobs grew louder, filling the room. It was the sound of someone finally realizing the magnitude of their actions. But I wasn't finished. And Harding? I asked, my voice low, dangerous. Did he make a mistake too? At the mention of his name, her sobs quieted. She looked up, her face streaked with tears, fear flashing in her eyes. What did you do? She asked, her voice trembling. I smiled then, slow and deliberate. You really think he's going to come running to your rescue? Harding is finished, Claire. His empire is crumbling. His investors are pulling out. His name is being dragged through the mud. He's about to be hit with fraud charges. And you're tangled in his mess. All those deals you helped him with, they're about to come back to bite you. Her face went pale, her eyes widening in horror. No, no, that's not possible. He told me everything was legal. He lied, I said, cutting her off again. Just like you lied to me. Her breath hitched, and she shook her head, as if trying to convince herself that this wasn't happening. What's going to happen to me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I stepped closer, my eyes cold and unflinching. That's the thing, Claire. You're on your own now. Harding won't protect you. He can't. You think he'll sacrifice himself for you? You were just a pawn, just like everyone else in his life. The truth hit her like a freight train. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that everything she had traded her soul for had turned to ash. She was drowning in her own decisions, and there was no one left to pull her out. She stood up suddenly, shaky on her feet. I have to talk to him. I can fix this. I just need to. You won't reach him, I said, my voice flat. He's already running. He's done with you. Her face crumpled, and for the first time since this all started, I saw her for what she truly was, desperate, broken, and utterly alone. She clutched her phone in a shaking hand, her eyes darting to the screen, hoping for a response from Harding that would never come. Call him, I said, my tone mocking now. See for yourself. With trembling fingers, she dialed his number. The phone rang once, twice, and then went straight to voicemail. Her shoulders slumped, and she tried again and again. The same result each time. He's gone, Claire, I said softly, the final nail in the coffin. You don't matter to him anymore. She sank to the floor, the phone slipping from her grasp. She was sobbing again, but this time there was no pretense, no attempt to salvage what was left. She knew I had destroyed everything she had built her life around, and now she had nothing. I watched her crumble, the weight of her choices pressing down on her until she was a sobbing mess on the floor. It should have felt like victory. This was what I had planned for, what I had worked so meticulously to achieve. I had broken her, shattered the life she had abandoned me for. But as I stood there watching her, a strange emptiness settled in my chest. The anger that had driven me for weeks had dissipated, leaving behind a hollow void. I had expected to feel triumphant, vindicated. Instead, I felt nothing. Claire's sobs echoed in the silence of the room, but they no longer mattered. I had done what I set out to do. I had taken control, had made her feel the same helplessness I had endured, and now there was nothing left to say. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there, crumpled on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her choices. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, sharp and bracing. I stood on the porch, staring out into the darkness. Harding was finished. Claire was broken. Everything had fallen apart, just as I had planned, and yet the victory felt hollow. I had won, but at what cost? I glanced back toward the house where Claire's sobs still echoed faintly through the walls. The woman who had once shared my life, who had stood by my side, was now nothing more than a ghost in my past. And as I stood there, I realized that I had become something different, something darker. I had destroyed them, but in the process, I had destroyed a part of myself too. With a heavy sigh, I turned away from the house and walked into the night. As I walked into the night, the darkness swallowed me whole, cold air seeping into my lungs with each deliberate step. I kept moving, not because I had anywhere to go, but because staying still felt impossible. My mind was a whirlpool of emotions, each pulling me in a different direction: rage, emptiness, satisfaction. But above all, I felt something deeper, something I hadn't expected: regret. I had spent weeks, maybe months, crafting the perfect revenge. Each piece had been set meticulously, every step calculated. I'd taken my pain and shaped it into a weapon, one that had now struck both Claire and Harding down. Yet now that the dust was settling, there was no joy in their downfall, just a quiet void. I paused at the edge of the street, the faint glow of the street light casting a long shadow ahead of me. This was supposed to be the moment of triumph. Harding was ruined, Claire was broken, and their world had collapsed just as I had planned. But I was no longer the man who had first started down this path. The truth was, the person I had been before all this, the Eric who trusted, who loved, he was gone. He had disappeared somewhere between the pieces. Honesty-wise, the betrayal and the vengeance, I had become something else, someone darker. The man who had orchestrated this revenge bore little resemblance to the one Claire had married all those years ago. I had destroyed them, but in the process I had destroyed a part of myself too. The stillness of the night gave me room to think, space to confront what I had become. The anger that had driven me for so long had given way to a stark emptiness. I had achieved my goal, but now there was nothing left to hold on to. Claire was a stranger, Harding a casualty, and me, I wasn't sure anymore. I kept walking, mindlessly moving through the streets until I found myself by the river. The water was calm, reflecting the moonlight in broken shards across the surface. I stood there for a while, staring out at the ripples, letting the silence sink in. Was it worth it? I had to ask myself that, had to face the brutal truth of what I'd done. In my pursuit of revenge, I had let go of everything I once valued. I'd pushed aside my humanity, my sense of right and wrong, all in the name of retribution. And now that it was over, I was left wondering if the price I'd paid was too high. I couldn't undo what had happened. I couldn't go back and change the choices Claire had made or the path that had led me here. But I had to live with it now, with the knowledge that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, came with a cost. A cost I was only just beginning to understand. The bitterness of it all gnawed at me. I had always thought that revenge would bring closure, that seeing Claire and Harding's lives crumble would somehow make me feel whole again. But it hadn't. It had only deepened the wounds, left me with scars that would never fully heal. The betrayal, the anger, it was still there beneath the surface, festering. I couldn't stay here, in this place of regret. I had to move forward, even if I wasn't sure where forward led. Taking a deep breath, I turned away from the river and began the slow walk back to the house. The house where Claire still was, crumpled and defeated. A part of me didn't want to return, didn't want to face the aftermath of what I'd done, but I couldn't just walk away from it either. This was my life now, whether I liked it or not. By the time I reached the front door, the moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over everything. I hesitated, hand on the doorknob, before finally pushing it open. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Claire was no longer in the living room where I had left her. The only sign of her was the faint sound of movement upstairs. I didn't go to her. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I walked through the house, each room a reminder of what had once been. The life we had shared, the memories we had built. They all seemed so distant now. Like another life, lived by another person. I found myself in my office, the place where I had spent so many nights planning, strategizing, turning my grief into a calculated weapon. The desk was cluttered with papers, remnants of the plans I had put into motion. I stared at them for a moment, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Revenge had consumed me. It had driven every decision I had made since the moment I discovered Claire's betrayal. And now, as I stood in the aftermath, I realized that it had changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't the same man I had been before. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. I sank into the chair, staring at the wall in front of me, my mind racing. I had to figure out what came next. There was no going back to the way things were, no undoing the choices I had made. But I had to find a way to move forward, to rebuild something out of the ashes of the life I had destroyed. The next morning came slowly, the light filtering through the blinds as the world outside carried on, oblivious to the wreckage inside. I sat there for hours thinking, reflecting on everything that had happened. There was a strange sense of finality to it all, as though the chapter had closed, but I wasn't ready to turn the page yet. At some point, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here, in this house, in this life that no longer felt like mine. I needed to leave, to start over somewhere new, somewhere that wasn't haunted by the ghosts of betrayal and revenge. I packed a bag, the essentials, and left the rest. The house, the memories, Claire, they were no longer mine to hold on to. I walked out the door without looking back, the weight of everything I was leaving behind heavy on my shoulders. As I drove away, the road stretching out before me, I felt a strange sense of relief. The anger, the bitterness, it was still there, but it was fading bit by bit. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew that wherever it was, it would be away from this. The betrayal would always be a part of me. It had shaped me, changed me in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. But I wasn't going to let it define me. I had taken control of my fate once, and now it was time to do it again. This time for myself. The future was uncertain, and that was okay. I didn't need all the answers right now. What mattered was that I was free. Free from the anger, the need for revenge. Free to rebuild my life on my own terms. As the miles passed by, the sun climbing higher in the sky, I felt a quiet resolve settling over me. The past was behind me, and the future, while unclear, held possibilities I hadn't considered before. For the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't know what the road ahead looked like, but I knew one thing. It was mine to walk. And for now, that was enough.